As temperatures plummeted to sub-zero levels and the biting wind cut through them relentlessly, the medieval English peasant faced one of the harshest challenges of his life: how to keep warm and survive the relentless winter. Living in the era of modern technologies and synthetic insulation materials, it is difficult to imagine what it is like to meet winter with only the simplest materials and centuries-old knowledge at our disposal. How did these people, without central heating and thermal underwear, manage not to freeze to death? The secrets of their winter clothing are far more complex and inventive than meets the eye, demonstrating amazing adaptability and deep knowledge of the environment. Get ready to learn about the innovative approaches and ingenious solution that allowed them to survive and thrive beyond all expectations. We will reveal 10 amazing facts about how medieval peasants protected themselves from the cold, using not only the resources available to them, but also a deep understanding of their bodies, the principles of thermodynamics in the environment. These facts will change your idea of the simple life of that time, showing that behind the apparent primitiveness, there was a real science of survival. Modern insulation materials, from down jackets to synthetic materials, work on the principle of creating many air layers that retain heat. Medieval peasants, who had no scientific knowledge of thermodynamics, intuitively used the same principle. Their coarse, minimally processed wool was a far cry from the soft and smooth cloth worn by nobles. Instead, it remained uneven, with many swirls, tangles, and natural air cavities created by the fibers. Peasant wool, often obtained directly from their own sheep, retained a significant amount of natural lanolin, an animal fat that made the fibers slightly water-repellent. But most importantly, air was trapped between the uneven fibers, creating millions of tiny pockets of air. These pockets acted as an excellent thermal insulator, trapping body heat and preventing it from dissipating, as well as preventing cold air from entering from the outside. Clothing made of such wool was, of course, heavy, cumbersome, and rather prickly, which required habit. However, its efficiency in preserving heat was unsurpassed. Even if such a woolen fabric got wet, which was inevitable in a damp English climate, the water did not immediately penetrate to the skin due to the lanolin and the density of the weave. And even wet wool, unlike cotton or linen, continues to retain a significant amount of heat due to the same air pockets and endothermic reactions, which was critical for survival since changing clothes was rare. Raw wool, with its unique ability to compress and then restore volume, served as an ideal filler for quilted clothing. On the rare occasions when a farmer could afford or make a quilted vest or jacket himself, wool that had not been extensively processed provided excellent insulation. Its fibers intertwined in a chaotic order, creating microscopic mazes in which warm air was trapped. Unlike down, which required regular whipping to maintain volume, coarse wool retained its structure better even after prolonged wear and exposure to moisture. This meant that the thermal insulation properties of clothing remained stable throughout the day, regardless of the activity of the farmer. Moreover, the natural dirt and dust that inevitably accumulated in such clothing also contributed to the compaction of fibers and additional heat retention, creating a kind of natural armor from the cold. This feature makes raw wool not just a material, but a dynamic system that has adapted to environmental conditions and the level of human activity. Modern tourists and mountain climbers are well aware of the principle of layering in clothing, but for medieval peasants, this was not just a recommendation, but a vital necessity brought to perfection. They wore up to 5 or 6 layers of clothing, each of which performed its own specific function in a complex thermoregulation system. The first layer of clothing usually consisted of a coarse linen shirt or tunic. Linen, although not the warmest material, had an important property. It well removed moisture, sweat from the body, preventing hypothermia when the sweat evaporated. This layer also served as a barrier between the skin and more scratchy woolen clothing. The second layer is a denser but still relatively light wool tunic, which began the process of thermal insulation. The third layer is a long woolen robe, khat or kaftan, often reaching to the knees and ankles, providing extensive insulation. And only the fourth outer layer was a massive woolen cloak or cape, often with an integrated hood that provided ultimate protection from wind, rain, and snow. This elaborate system allowed the peasants to adjust their body temperature as needed, When they were actively working in the field, when it got hot, they could take off their outer raincoat or even their robes. In cool weather or during rest, when the body was cooling down, layers were added back. It is important that each layer creates its own air gap, enhancing the overall thermal insulation effect. The more layers and air pockets between them, the more efficiently heat was stored. This system also had a practical advantage. If the top layer got wet, it could be removed and hung out to dry by the hearth, while the remaining layers continued to retain body heat, minimizing discomfort and the risk of hypothermia. This was not just a random collection of rags, but a carefully calculated survival strategy. Additionally, each of the layers of the peasants' multi-layered clothing played a role not only in thermoregulation, but also in protection against mechanical damage. Rough working conditions in the field, contact with branches, stones, agricultural tools required strong clothing. Several layers of dense fabric provided significant shock absorption and reduced the risk of cuts and abrasions. The lower linen layer, being relatively smooth, prevented the skin from chafing with coarser woolen fabrics, which was especially important during prolonged physical work. This also contributed to hygiene. Linen was washed more easily and dried faster, allowing you to maintain a minimum level of cleanliness of the body, despite the lack of regular water treatments. Every item of clothing, from the undershirt to the raincoat, was the result of centuries of observation and practical experience. The materials were chosen not by chance, but based on their functional properties. Linen for moisture removal, wool for heat preservation, felt for protection from getting wet and wind. It wasn't just clothing, but part of a survival system optimized for extreme living conditions. The use of natural dyes, if any, was minimal, which preserved the natural properties of the hair and did not affect its thermal insulation qualities. Wear resistance was also a key factor. The clothes had to last for years, withstanding daily loads. Multi-layering contributed to this by distributing the load between the layers. If one layer wore out, it could be patched or replaced without throwing away all the clothes. This was economically feasible and sustainable, long before these concepts became part of modern discourse. Reuse of materials and repairs were the norm, not the exception. Fragments of old clothing were often changed into children's clothing or used as patches, demonstrating the complete utilization of resources. In addition to the main layers, the peasants also actively used various accessories that complemented the multi-layered system. These could be leg wraps made from strips of fabric or felt that were wound over stockings or directly on the feet, providing extra warmth and protecting the shins from dirt and moisture. Mittens or gloves, often made of coarse wool or felt, were necessary to protect the hands from cold and calluses when working. Scarves or neckerchiefs, if available, added another layer of warmth around the neck and chest, areas through which significant heat loss occurs. These additional elements were not a luxury, but a functional necessity, completing the image of the peasant thermoregulatory machine. Hoods, as already mentioned, played a special role. They were often part of the cloak, but they could also be separate elements. The hood, which fitted snugly to the head, protected the ears and neck from wind and frost. Unlike modern hats, hoods often had a longer tail or collar that could be wrapped around the neck, creating an additional barrier against the cold. This element demonstrated a deep understanding of human anatomy and how heat is lost through exposed areas of the body. In the absence of pollination in most homes, as well as constant work in the open air, protecting the head was the first priority. In conditions when leather was an expensive material, and shoes made of wood or thin fabric did not provide sufficient protection from getting wet and cold, farmers actively used felt. This amazing material, a precursor to modern non-wovens, was produced by piling wool under the influence of heat, moisture, and mechanical pressure. The result was an incredibly dense, wear-resistant, water-repellent, and most importantly, very warm material. Felt was used to make thick shoe linings that were inserted inside wooden clogs or simple leather shoes, providing additional insulation from the cold, wet ground. In some cases, felt was used to make solid boots or thick leg wraps, which served as excellent protection in conditions of snow and slush. Felt caps, cap hat, and especially hoods, which were often part of the cloak or a separate element, were indispensable for protecting the head, ears, and neck from penetrating wind and frostbite. Unlike knitwear, which could pass wind through its loops, felt did not have such a structure, which made it practically windproof. Its density and internal porous structure provided excellent thermal insulation. It was a simple but extremely effective and affordable solution for the most vulnerable parts of the body, the legs and head, through which the main heat loss occurred. Felt allowed the peasants to work outside for hours, keeping the minimum necessary body temperature even in the most severe frost. The process of making felt was labor-intensive, but did not require complex equipment, which made it affordable for any peasant farm with sheep. The wool was laid out in layers, wetted with hot water or steam, and then repeatedly squeezed, rolled, and beaten so that the fibers intertwined with each other. This process could take hours, but the result was worth it. The resulting felt was so dense that it could repel water, which was critical in rainy and slushy Europe. Felt also had shock-absorbing properties, which reduced the load on the legs when walking on uneven terrain and protected against bruises. This quality was especially valuable for shoes and seats that could be made from this material. The durability of felt products was also legendary. Properly made felt could last for decades, withstanding harsh operating conditions. It didn't tear as easily as woven materials and was puncture-resistant. If the felt got wet, it, like wool, retained a significant part of its thermal insulation properties. This was a significant advantage over other materials, such as linen or cotton, which instantly lost their thermal insulation properties when wet and became a source of supercooling. The possibility of making felt directly on the farm, without the need to turn to specialized workshops, made it a truly peasant innovation, accessible to the broad masses of the population. Felt could also be used to make various seals for doors and windows in peasant houses, which helped to preserve heat inside the dwelling. Simple mats and felt bedding provided additional insulation from the cold floor. In some cases, felt shields or pads were used to protect joints or vulnerable body parts during heavy work where there was a risk of injury. This demonstrates the versatility of felt and its role in the everyday life of a medieval peasant. The intuitive understanding of thermoregulation and adaptation to the environment displayed by medieval peasants was astounding. Without access to scientific knowledge, they developed a sophisticated clothing system that made the most of the available resources through trial and error, as well as the transfer of experience from generation to generation. It was not just the ability to sew, but a deep knowledge of the properties of materials and their interaction. They understood how moisture affects heat loss, how air trapped in fibers retains heat, and how layering can regulate body temperature depending on activity levels and weather conditions. This knowledge was not written down in books, but was put into everyday practice and passed on through mentoring and imitation. Every peasant learned from childhood to dress properly for work in the field, for protection from rain and snow, for keeping warm in a cold house. It was part of their cultural code of survival. Their innovations were not the result of laboratory research, but the result of strict selection. Those who did not know how to effectively protect themselves from the cold simply did not survive. Thus, the peasant dress became the pinnacle of practical design, focused on functionality and survival in harsh environments. She showed a deep respect for nature and the ability to live in harmony with it, using its gifts to ensure their own well-being. It can be said that medieval peasants were the first climate control engineers, although without a formal education. They have mastered the art of manipulating air layers, humidity, and the properties of natural fibers to create the most effective personal thermoregulation system. Their approach to clothing was not just a matter of style or aesthetics, but a matter of life and death. This makes their methods no less, and perhaps even more impressive, than many modern technological advances, since they were achieved with minimal resources and a deep practical understanding of the world around them. In addition to the ubiquitous wool, medieval peasants actively cultivated cannabis, Cannabis sativa. It was a versatile plant. Its stems produced strong fibers that were used not only for making ropes, bags, fishing nets, and coarse fabrics for everyday clothing, but also, less obviously, as a filler insulation. For extra insulation, especially in the coldest items of clothing, such as thick jackets, quilted caftans, or linings for heavy raincoats, loose layers of hemp fibers could be laid. These fibers, though not as soft and elastic as down or wool, created an effective insulating layer, keeping the air inside. It was a kind of analog of modern batting or synthepon, but from completely natural, affordable, and renewable fibers. Hemp was cheap, easy to grow practically everywhere, and had fairly good thermal insulation properties. The use of hemp fiber as a filler may not have been ubiquitous for all everyday clothing, but it was used to create warmer overalls for working in the coldest months, or for those who spent a lot of time outside, shepherds, hunters, logging workers. This method demonstrates the ingenuity of farmers in using every available resource to solve vital tasks, turning an ordinary agricultural plant into an indispensable element of winter survival. Hemp, being an extremely unpretentious plant, grew on any soil and did not require special care, which made it an ideal raw material for peasant farming. Its fibers had a high tensile strength, which ensured the durability of manufactured products. An important aspect was that hemp had natural antimicrobial properties, which helped reduce the proliferation of bacteria and fungi in clothing, especially in conditions of rare washing. This not only improved hygiene, but also reduced unpleasant odors, which was important for people who were constantly in close contact with each other. Thus, hemp fiber not only warmed, but also helped to maintain a certain level of cleanliness and freshness of clothing. The process of processing cannabis was labor-intensive, but well mastered by farmers. The stems were soaked in water, a process known as wetting, to soften the fiber-binding pectin. Then they were dried and ruffled, separating the fibers from the stiff part. The resulting fibers were combed and formed into bundles that could be used as a filler. Unlike wool, which required more complex processing and spinning to produce the fabric, hemp fibers could be used raw for stuffing, which simplified their use as insulation. This made hemp an affordable alternative to more expensive and difficult to process wool, especially for layers that were not intended for direct contact with the skin. The innovation was not only in the use of cannabis as a filler, but also in its ability to wick away moisture. Unlike cotton, which loses its thermal insulation properties when wet, hemp, like wool, is able to quickly release moisture, while retaining a significant amount of air in its fibers. This property was critical for active Cravians who sweated while working. The hemp insulation helped prevent hypothermia caused by sweat evaporation, creating a dry and warm microclimate inside the clothing. This demonstrates the farmer's deep, if intuitive, understanding of the principles thermoregulation, of thermoregulation and dehumidification. The use of cannabis also made environmental and economic sense. This plant depleted the soil much less than other crops and required less water. Its widespread cultivation reduced dependence on foreign trade and ensured the self-sufficiency of peasant farms in the production of necessary materials. It was a prime example of a cyclical economy and sustainable development long before these terms were introduced. There was practically no waste. The woody parts of the stems could be used as fuel or for construction, and the seeds could be used for food. The clothing of the peasants, contrary to popular stereotypes about the gray mass, was not always exceptionally dull and unpainted. Of course, it did not differ in the brightness and variety of colors of noble outfits, but the use of natural dyes was common. Many of these dyes derived from plants and minerals not only gave clothing a certain color, for example, vita for various shades of blue, madder for red and brown, crusher or resida dye for yellow and green, but also could have unexpected, useful properties. Some plant dyes, such as vita, contain compounds that could have mild antibacterial and even antifungal properties. This was extremely important in conditions where clothes were washed very rarely, sometimes only a few times a year, especially in the cold season, and they were constantly in contact with the body, sweat, and dirt. Antibacterial properties help prevent the development of unpleasant odors, and also reduce the risk of skin irritations and infections caused by the accumulation of microbes, injury, and dirty clothes. In addition, the use of darker colors, brown, dark blue, blackish, derived from these natural pigments was of practical importance. Dark surfaces absorb more sunlight, converting it to heat. On rare sunny winter days, this provided an additional, albeit small, thermal advantage, helping the body stay in a comfortable zone. Thus, the choice of color was not only aesthetic or symbolic, but also functional, demonstrating a comprehensive approach to clothing where even dye served as part of the survival system. In addition to their antibacterial properties, some dyes may also have insecticidal properties, repelling lice, fleas, and other parasites that were the scourge of medieval life. For example, the use of nutshells to produce brown shades could give clothes a slight smell that repels insects. This was an indirect but very valuable property, contributing to hygiene and comfort as much as possible in those conditions. Thus, farmers, not knowing the chemical composition, intuitively chose those plants for coloring that gave them additional advantages. The dyeing process was another time-consuming but important step in a peasant's life. Dyes often required certain processing: soaking, boiling, fermentation. To fix the color, mordants were used substances such as ash, alum, or various mineral salts that helped the dye adhere more firmly to the fibers of the fabric. These mordants could also affect the final shade, expanding the palette of available colors. Despite the fact that it was a complex process, its development allowed farmers to improve the quality and functionality of their clothing, adding valuable properties to it. Dark clothing colors not only absorbed heat, but also better concealed dirt and wear, which was extremely practical for clothes that were worn daily and rarely washed. This allowed the clothes to keep a relatively decent appearance for longer, which, although not the main concern of the Christians, still played a role in their daily lives. The ability to give clothing any color other than the natural shade of unpainted wool or linen could also serve as a way of expressing individuality as much as possible within the social constraints of the time. It was a modest but important element of cultural identity. With no central heating and limited washing and drying facilities, medieval peasants developed an effective strategy for using their scanty clothing. They didn't have the luxury of changing their wardrobe every day. Therefore, their daytime clothing, the ones they wore to work in the fields, go about their business, and interact with the environment, was often separate from their night clothing. At night, after a long day, the peasants could take off their dirty and possibly wet work clothes. Over the basic, thin linen shirt, which served as underwear and absorbed sweat, they could wear a thicker, older woolen tunic or faggot robe, which served as a kind of sleeping bag or night clothes. This night tunic might be worn out or too big for day work, but its main function was to preserve body heat while sleeping in unheated or poorly heated dwellings. During the day, it could hang by the hearth, airing out and drying out. In the morning, before going to work, the night clothes were removed and folded, and the day clothes, which could be cold and wet from the night air, were put on again. This simple but ingenious method allowed you to maximize the preservation of body heat for 24 hours. It also reduced the wear and tear of the main work clothes, extending their service life, and allowed them to rest and air out a little, which was important for hygiene in those conditions. Thus, the peasants intuitively applied the principle of clean and dirty clothing, optimizing each element of their modest wardrobe. This system of day and night clothing was not just a convenience, but a vital strategy for maintaining hygiene and preventing disease. By removing their dirty work clothes at night, the peasants reduced the body's contact with germs, parasites, and dirt accumulated during the day. This could significantly reduce the risk of skin infections, rashes, and other diseases caused by poor sanitation. At the same time, nighted clothing, being less susceptible to contamination, remained relatively clean and served as a more hygienic layer for sleeping. Airing daytime clothing near the hearth also helped get rid of some of the moisture, odors, and even some parasites that might have died from the dryness and heat. An important aspect of this practice was the psychological separation between the working day and rest. Although the life of a peasant was inextricably linked to work, a change of clothing, albeit symbolic, helped separate the time of work from the time of sleep and recovery. It was a kind of ritual that helped preserve some semblance of order and structure in their heavy daily routine. The night tunic was probably looser and more comfortable, not restricting movement, which contributed to a deeper and more restorative sleep, which was extremely important for maintaining physical fitness. In addition, the availability of separate night clothing allowed optimizing the use of resources. Old, worn, or torn wool tunics that were no longer suitable for hard work in the field could be converted into nightgowns. This extended the life of each piece of clothing and demonstrated the principles of waste minimization and maximum utilization. Thus, each piece of cloth had its own value and was applied until complete wear. This was not just know-how, but an integral part of survival, embodying a deep understanding of efficiency and frugality. This approach to clothing was part of a broader system of home economics, where every resource was used to the maximum effect. The peasants could not afford to waste, and their wardrobe was a prime example of this. They lived in an environment where every thread, every fiber had its own value. Their ingenuity and practicality in clothing were not just the result of poverty, but also evidence of a deep understanding of the natural world and its resources. It was an example of a sustainable lifestyle shaped by centuries of adaptation and survival. The belt was an integral part of the medieval peasant's wardrobe, used by both men and women. Its function went far beyond simply holding clothes or carrying tools. The belt played an important role in thermal regulation, helping farmers adapt to changing conditions. The tunics and robes that formed the basis of the peasant costume were quite spacious and baggy, which helped to circulate the air. When it was particularly cold or the farmer was in the wind, he could tighten his belt, sometimes even 2 or even 3 belts, creating additional pressure on his clothes and body. This pressed the layers of fabric closer together and to the body, reducing the circulation of cold air under the clothes and preventing it from entering from below. Thus, a denser air layer was created, which better retained body heat. This was akin to how modern jackets have puffs at the waist and hem. On the contrary, when performing heavy physical work, such as plowing or logging, or when staying indoors, for example, in a warm hut, where the risk of overheating increased, the belt could be loosened or even temporarily removed. This provided better ventilation and helped the body cool down, preventing excessive sweating that could lead to hypothermia after stopping activity. The belt was also used to secure a purse, knife, tools, or food bags, but its role in actively managing body heat was equally important and demonstrates the peasants' keen understanding of the principles of comfort in harsh environments. Additionally, the belt also allowed the peasant to adjust the length and volume of his tunic or robe. By pulling the hem of the garment higher and securing it with a belt, it was possible to prevent the lower part of the garment from getting wet and dirty when walking in mud or working in wet conditions. This was especially true in rainy weather or when navigating swampy areas. Shortened clothing not only stayed drier, but also allowed greater freedom of movement when performing active tasks, such as mowing or sewing, where long floors could get in the way. In addition, the tight fit of the belt in the lower back area could serve as additional support for the back when carrying heavy loads or performing work that requires bending. This, although indirectly, helped to conserve energy and reduce fatigue, which also affected the overall ability of the farmer to survive and work efficiently during the long day. Thus, the belt was not just a functional element for carrying objects, but a multi-purpose tool that was actively integrated into the daily life and survival strategy of the medieval peasant. Although these are not clothes in the usual sense, the dwelling of a medieval peasant was an integral part of his winter wardrobe and played a huge role in preserving heat. The main building material for the walls of most farmhouses in England was wattle and daub. Wattle and daub. This is a technology in which the frame of branches, wattle, was coated with a mixture of clay, straw, manure, and sand. These materials, being porous and organic, created literally millions of microscopic air pockets inside the walls. The straw woven into the clay acted as reinforcement and, most importantly, as an excellent natural heat insulator. The roofs of the houses were covered with a thick layer of thatch, which also had exceptional thermal insulation properties due to its porous structure and air gaps between the stems. Thus, the house was not just a shelter, but in fact a large, stationary piece of clothing that protects from the elements as well as the warmest fabrics. This design provided phenomenal passive thermal insulation, allowing you to maintain the temperature inside the home at a level sufficient to survive, even in the most severe frosts, minimizing heat loss. Even a small hearth located in the center of such a warmed hut could significantly increase the temperature in a confined space, making it habitable. The house, like a layered garment, was part of the peasant's complex survival system. Medieval peasant farming was as waste-free as possible. Each element obtained from animals found its own application, including for insulation. Although full-fledged fur products made from sable, Marten or fox were the privilege of the exceptionally rich strata of the population. The peasants did not throw out more affordable from the moves of animal husbandry, which could warm them. The feathers of birds, especially geese and ducks, which were bred in almost every farm for meat and eggs, could be used as stuffing. These feathers, due to their lightness and ability to hold air, were an ideal filler for primitive down jackets, quilted tunics or blankets that were sewn so that the feathers did not stray. Such feather clothing or bedding provided excellent warmth. Bole coarser fur, such as rabbit, fox, goat, or even stray cat skins, or more commonly, sheepskin with wool, which was left over after the animals were slaughtered for meat and to produce wool for spinning, could be used for sewing linings, collars, sleeves, or even primitive stockings for the feet. Such elements were sewn to the main clothing, providing additional concentrated heat in the most severe frosts. For example, the sheepskin worn inside with wool provided excellent insulation and served as an analog of the modern fur lining. It was a vivid example of waste, free use of resources, where every element of the animal found its own application to increase comfort and survival in the cold season. Peasant clothing was not a fashion item or seasonal purchase, but a critical survival tool and long-term investment. It was not bought every year, but carefully repaired, darned, and adapted until it completely fell into disrepair. Patches, often made of contrasting fabrics, were not a sign of poverty, but a common occurrence and evidence of thrift. Old, worn-out pieces of wool fabric could be turned into knee or elbow pads to reinforce the areas most susceptible to wear. They could also be used to make additional inner layers or linings for existing clothing, thereby enhancing the thermal insulation without the need to create a completely new thing. For example, a worn outer robe could be cut and used as a lining for a new raincoat or warmer tunic, creating a layered structure of old materials. It was a constant, almost intuitive process of improving and modernizing your wardrobe. Every time an item fell into disrepair, the farmer didn't just throw it away, but looked for ways to make the most of the remaining material. This process was based on deep practical experience passed down from generation to generation and the strict need for survival. The peasant did not just wear clothes, he interacted with them, making the most of every piece of fabric and fiber, turning the worn into functional and the old into improved. This approach demonstrates not only thrift, but also remarkable ingenuity in managing limited resources. Thus, the secrets of medieval English peasant winter clothing lay not in the availability of mythical technologies or exotic materials, but in their innovative use, deep understanding of the principles of thermal insulation, and amazing ingenuity born of necessity. From the rough but phenomenally effective wool with its unique air pockets to the complex multi-layered system, from dense felt to protect limbs, to the use of hemp and even feathers as fillers, every element of their meager wardrobe has been thought through to the smallest detail and optimized for survival in harsh, unforgiving conditions. The peasants of the Middle Ages did not just tolerate the cold, accepting their fate. They actively fought against it, using all the resources available to them and the centuries-old experience of their ancestors. Their approach to clothing was not just functional, but a whole set of knowledge passed down from generation to generation, a kind of folk thermal protection engineering. Their ability to survive and even function relatively comfortably in conditions that today seem unthinkable to us without modern technology is a real testament to their resilience, practicality, and amazing ability to adapt to the most complex challenges of nature. If you like this look into the past and want to learn more amazing and unobvious facts about the daily life of people in the Middle Ages, about how they solved the most pressing problems, be sure to subscribe to our channel. There are still many unobvious secrets and fascinating stories ahead that will change your perception of this distant era.